Just 2 more episodes, including this one, until I present my potentially scandalous gumbo findings at the Intelligent Speech Conference 2022 on June 25th. But it's not just me. Take a quick listen.
Intelligent Speech is happening online on Saturday, June 25th, 10 a.m. to 6 p.m. Eastern Time, and consists of 4 simultaneous rooms presenting engaging talks, roundtable discussions, and rousing Q&As.
Trevor Cully from the History of Persia podcast.
Tegan Phillips of the History and Philosophy of Physics podcast.
And Gary Stevens from the History in the Bible podcast.
Sarah of the Rejects and Revolutionaries podcast.
Me and Christy, the host of Terranauts.
Jamie Jeffers from the British History podcast.
Tickets are available at intelligentspeechconference.com, and your ticket entitles you to both live attendance and access to all recordings after the fact if you cannot be there at the time or want to catch more of the amazing content happening simultaneously.
Ancient Persian propaganda in modern Iran.
Napoleonic-themed roundtable.
Solar spectroscopy.
Themistocles and the space program and the collective power of the big idea.
Tickets again are available at intelligentspeechconference.com, and we hope to see you there.
Now, back to me. Episode 49, Oysters and Lesser Shellfish. Hello and welcome to the History of American Food. This week I'll be looking at the problem with understanding the world through spontaneous generation and the English excessive affection for oysters. If you'd like to learn more about that and how they reacted when they discovered that the Atlantic shelf from New Brunswick, Canada to the Gulf of Mexico was a giant carpet made out of oysters, and how they felt about the rest of the shellfish, pull up to your place at the table and let's dig in. The first thing you need to know about Europe generally and England specifically was that in the 18th century, they loved oysters. There was no dish that could not be improved by oysters, and no banquet was complete without them. So when explorers and colonists showed up on the North American coast and found it covered with oysters, they figured they had scored. Sure, there were mussels and cockles and clams and lobsters and crabs and stuff, and we'll cover them briefly, but oysters were everything. Oysters were king. And when the colonists got there, it seemed like endless oysters. Oysters for miles. Oysters forever. And at that point, they were more or less correct. Every coast they landed on had a healthy supply of oysters, specifically Crassostrea virginica, the eastern oyster. And this was not news to the local tribes. In all the areas where they landed, there were high piles of oyster shell middens to be found at fish camps that various tribes made as they had seasonally visited oyster beaches for centuries. Even though there is only one native East Coast oyster species, it comes in a variety of shapes and sizes. These variations are driven by the type of bottom it lives on, sandy muck or hard rocks, and the temperature of water it's growing in. Generally, this means cold water oysters grow slower, so are on average smaller, and oysters grown on rocks are rounder and fatter. Warm water oysters grow faster, and muck bottoms mean the oysters stack, so they are flat and wide. These variations in environment have made a wild variety of subpopulations, but at base, they are all the same species. This, of course, doesn't mean it's okay to say, oh, the depleted oyster population here can just be propped up with that transplanted oyster from there, and everything will be okay. The historical rich in various subpopulations of oysters represented riches in biodiversity. It made them resilient to just about everything nature threw at them. But in more modern times, they come close to getting taken out by a 1-2 punch of first habitat destruction through pollution and silting, and then second, by insane overharvesting. For our 18th century colonists, pollution was simply part of the landscape. The British had made the rivers and estuaries of home their sewers for human and manufacturing waste, and simply brought their habit with them, along with their love of oysters. The Thames and the rivers emptying into Southampton, Portsmouth and Liverpool had long been locations where fish and shellfish were imported from elsewhere, since the ancient local shellfish reefs and fish runs had long been done in by the human inhabitants. So when the colonists arrived on the North American shores to find the waters filled with fish and covered with oysters and some other, to them, less awesome shellfish, they really believed they had arrived in the promised land. Not so much milk and honey, but oysters and deer for sure. And as far as the colonists thought, if they thought about it at all, was that the oysters, like the cod and salmon swimming above them, would never run out. Because one of the big ideas on the table in the natural philosopher circles when looking at the state of the natural world was spontaneous generation. There are things that we think have been around forever, but when you dig back a bit, you see how shallow their presence is. I mean, I belong to the first generation of people to have learned about plate tectonics in elementary school. Thanks to the disaster movies of the 90s and 2000s, it feels like we've had a grasp on how earthquakes work for a really long time. But it's actually only been a few decades. Crazy. In that same spirit, it's wild to consider that in the early 1700s, the scientific method was barely a thing. The particular regimen of hypothesis, test, communicate, test, revise, and more test, ta-da, theory, was literally the new hotness in Europe. Metallurgy, distillation, and chemical analysis were shifting from the deep, dark secrets of alchemy, where individual knowledge, incantation, and secrecy were being edged out by the excitement of philosophical societies, printing one's own findings in books and exchanging them all over Europe in Latin. It was the first age in Europe of the science celebrity. And one of the ideas up for consideration was spontaneous generation. This is an idea that's been around since at least Aristotle, and from a certain angle, it kind of makes sense. The oversimplified version is that certain things are born from mothers or eggs, like cows and chickens. It's pretty easy to see this and follow it as it happens. But other things, where the fertilization and growth of the animal happens somewhere unknown or at a very tiny scale, this is harder to follow. So the idea that meat, if left to rot, spontaneously generated maggots, or the mud spontaneously generates frogs, or that the ocean simply spontaneously makes fish and oysters, you can see how ideas like that would form. Now, to be fair, we still haven't sorted out the full story of eel generation, so hey, that could still be the ocean. But spontaneously generating oysters, layered on top of this, especially in the colonies that had heavy servings of religious piety in their founding philosophy, was the idea of biblical stasis. That is, the world is as it was made and will not be changing. And the bounty provided by the Almighty was His plan and would only change by His hand. There was nothing, for good or for ill, that humans could do to effect change. As long as they all lived within the rules, that is. So be good, and the miraculous bounty would remain. Be bad, and that's when things go wrong. And, by the way, your efforts to change things for the worse, or even for the better, those are useless. So with these ideas firmly in place, there was no worry about the oysters or anything else running out. They were just there and were for the use of the children of God. So with no worries about how oysters got there or whether a sustained harvest of them, shipped all over the world in barrels, pickled in the newly plentiful Caribbean salt, might have a noticeable effect on the supply of oysters in the long run. And at this point, they were kind of right. Oyster harvesting and processing was entirely done by human muscle alone. So at this point, there was a limit to the sheer number of oysters that could be landed. In fact, just how did an oysterman get oysters back in the day? Yes, there were the ones that could be plucked up from the rocks and the mud along the tide line. But once those were gone, dugout canoes and tongs. The outrageous timber riches were good for more than just making barrels and burning charcoal. They were good for making boats and boat parts. Okay, I've covered that. And for making tools. Oyster tongs were long-handled things, like 6 to 12 feet or 2 to 4 meters long, with basically two rakes facing each other. The oysterman closes the rakes together and lifts the trapped oysters into the end of the canoe. I haven't been able to suss out whether this particular tech was a method brought from England or an adaptation of local indigenous tech, or a spontaneous invention in the last half of the 18th century as the shoreline and knee-deep oysters were all eaten up. And eaten up they were. My 18th century cookbooks runneth over with oyster recipes. Oyster soup, oyster pie, broiled oysters, oyster fricassee, oyster sauce, oyster stuffing, ragouts of oysters, oyster loaves, pickled oysters, so many pickled oysters, and of course, oyster ketchup. And the recipes call for large oysters, or small oysters, or the nicest oysters you can get, and so on. They were practically free, and so were eaten both plain, as in stewed, creamed, or broiled and stuffed into bread for an oyster loaf, or as an oyster pie. Or they might be fancy, as in a ragout or a fricassee, where there is much moving of things in and out of pans, parboiling, frying, making sauces, enriching with nuts and eggs. They are also used to enrich and extend even more expensive items like turkeys, joints of veal, shoulders of oxen, braces of ducks, and roasts of sturgeon. For unlike today, where oysters are seen as a luxury and something of an event, they were food eaten by everyone and everywhere, as long as one was close to the coast, of course. And in the first 2/3 of the 18th century, check, yes, just about everyone was living in close proximity to the shore. Daniel Boone's trek through the Cumberland Gap won't come until the colonies are creeping up on war with the motherland. So for now, in the first part of the century, when there is practically no travel from major town to major town except by water, oysters are pretty available to all, especially pickled in the barrel. To pickle oysters for long keeping, take the oysters you have, from some dozens to 150, open them and save the liquor. Use that to rinse the gravel and grit from the oysters. Strain the liquor over the cleaned oysters and use that to scald them. Remove the oysters when they are plump. Boil, scum, and strain the liquor clean. Put to it white wine and vinegar. Well, add wine if you're a fancy, just vinegar if you aren't. The amount depends on the number of your oysters. Add to it a grossly pounded nutmeg, some white pepper, part bruised, part fine pounded, blades of mace, some cloves and bay leaves, as well as an onion slit. Boil up this pickle till it is of good taste. Set the hot pickle out in broad dishes until cold. Pour into a barrel of correct size. Add the oysters and cover. In 5 or 6 days, the oysters will be ready to eat. This will keep 3 weeks or a month if you remove oysters with a spoon and do not use your fingers. Side note, please do not follow 18th century recipes as guides for food safety. But speaking of barreled oysters, in a much earlier time, they were a delicacy that traveled from Britain to Rome. As is known in modern oyster circles, cold water oysters are plumper and possibly sweeter than warm water oysters. Measurably, chemically, actually. Cold water oysters have a higher amount of glycogen, a fatty acid made from glucose that they store as they eat greedily in the high plankton seasons to prepare for spawning. Warm water oysters do not do this, as the plankton concentration is pretty similar all year round. Therefore, the very most ridiculous Roman plutocrats, planted in cities through Europe, all the way down to the mother city, ordered in oysters from Britannia, packed in snow as quite the show of power. If they really wanted to brandish some power, I'm sure they served it up with a side of silphium. And this use of oysters as a power display on and off throughout history has created a wealth of myths that both the 18th century colonists and many modern oysters repeat to this day. The actually kind of helpful one, only eat oysters in months containing R, so not May, June, July, and August, had some utility in Northern Hemisphere Anglophone countries for both storage reasons, sun-warmed oysters that are a couple of days old, do not recommend, and because in cooler to cold waters, those are the months when oysters are going to be spawning, and as a result are flabby and odd and have a distinctively different taste that is unpleasant to even oyster lovers. But in our global food age, this is partly why you see the location of oysters shift around the globe if you eat oysters year-round. You wind up eating New Zealand or Rhode Island or British Columbia oysters as you work around spawning season. The second and possibly better known myth is that raw oysters are supposedly an aphrodisiac. This has much more to do with the appearance of the oyster. For a culture so intensely focused on excising any knowledge or of even acknowledging fleshly desires in public conversation, the introduction of oysters on the half shell into mixed company, that is, where men and women might be dining together, was seen as a socially risque move. Also, pragmatically, they are a quick energy snack containing protein, fats, and sugars along with a nice dose of vitamins and electrolytes. The last myth is that male oysters or maybe female oysters taste better or is somehow better than the other, and that you can tell female oysters and male oysters apart by looking at their shells. This is some long-lived hooey with a spectacular twist. You cannot, in fact, tell the sex of an oyster by looking at its shell. That has to do with its growing conditions. And while it is true the shell can clue you into the growing conditions that produce an oyster flavor you prefer or dislike, the shell is literally incapable of telling you things about an oyster's sex. Because the shell is a lifelong building project, but the oyster inside changes its sex multiple times over its life. The exact whys and hows and what the hecks are entirely beyond this show. I was more of a chemist in the end than a biologist, for heaven's sakes, but it has been repeatedly documented and regularly happens, just as it does in some fish and it seems some lizards as well, along with some other animals we probably haven't noticed yet. It's not that big a deal since all sexual reproduction tissue springs from a single source. It's just hormonal tweaks along the way that make it function in one way or another. And with oysters being the pretty darn simple creatures that they are, the tweaks aren't that huge. In each age, there are more myths added, and then they fall out of knowledge, just as now oysters are labeled as superfood or that any creepy crawlies they might carry can be eliminated if they are eaten with hot sauce or followed by a shot of alcohol. These myths, incidentally, are not so. Rather, it is the safety regulations we have in place, both for where they can be harvested and how they are kept, that keep them safe. And as times and worries change, these myths will also fade and new ones will also take their place. But the main three have been with us for an awfully long time. The R-month one may be on its way out because of global shipping. But the other two, who knows? And speaking of Roman snow shipping and global modern shipping, it is this love of oysters that helped prompt the development of the cold chain shipping of fresh groceries we have in place now. But it doesn't really get up and rolling until after the Civil War, so I'll save that discussion for then. In the 18th century, cold storage is still the spring house, hanging a bucket down a well, or the newest tech, the ice house. Okay, this isn't totally new technology-wise. Back in Europe, large manor-type houses already had versions of this. But the American variety of the ice house arises in fairly modest abodes since, once again, almost everyone lives near water at this point. When the pond or stream near you froze each winter, you'd have an ice cutting event, and ice could be placed in a well-insulated, mostly underground structure to keep perishable goods fresher for most of the year. And oysters, in their pickle barrels, certainly lived down there. But not everyone who craved oyster flavor had a cold room, so the craze for ketchup also encompassed the oysters. Now a little ketchup background. By the end of the 17th and all the way through the 18th century, navigation technology kept rapidly improving, as did boat building, boat arming, and boat provisioning. The rise of sea warfare and sea trade both pushed territories on either side of the Atlantic Ocean, on the northern shores of the Indian Ocean, and along the north and western edge of the Pacific, which to this day we of course call the Far East. Globes make for this funny directional thing sometimes. All this competitive sea activity pushed all these industries to new heights. For oyster purposes, the important part is that more people from Europe were sailing to more parts of the world and then touching back down on ever more parts of the world. Dockside taverns, which of course served oysters alongside beer and rum or gin or aquavit if you were in Europe, whoa, potent combo there, often collected payment in a wide array of coins. Dr. Jamie Goodall, in her book, Pirates and Privateers, resurfaces the phrase regarding the pirates who, quote, swaggered through the streets with purses full of hard money, Arabian dinars, Hindustani mohurs, Greek bezants, French louis d'or, and Spanish doubloons. These functionally stateless men, along with the sailors for many nations, were spending long stretches of time at sea. One perennial want was tasty condiments to combat the dull and ferociously unpalatable shipboard fare they were regularly fed. And those condiments had to stand up to a range of temperatures from freezing cold to tropical. Along and around the west coast of China, such a condiment was found, a spice version of fish sauce. In the local dialects, the name was ketchup or ketchup, where the K means sauce and the ending means fish. Along with spices for sale, sailors were also carrying around fish sauce to make the meals of boat-caught turtle or lobscouse tastier. By the way, lobscouse contained no lobster. Rather, it was hardtack ship's biscuit, salt beef, or salt pork, or salt fish, and dried peas instead. Ketchup was by then so commonly known and such a commodity that an early 18th century merchant's account of his trading with India includes a note that his favorite ketchup comes from Tonkin, a region in modern northern Vietnam. Back in England, and soon in their colonies, there was also ketchup madness. I mentioned anchovy ketchup last week, but it was not alone. Everything with deep flavors was ketchuped. There was walnut ketchup, lemon ketchup, mushroom ketchup, and that was actually a favorite and hung on in places to the modern day. And while anchovy ketchup was very popular in England, in the colonies, where anchovies had to be imported, but oysters were practically free, oyster ketchup was the preferred version and would hang on until being dethroned by the tomato. Oh, and the spelling. Ketchup was written with all the spellings. The 18th century printed word was wild. The advice was just sound it out. And they all did, with C's and K's and A's and E's and I's and O's and U's, but never Y's. So to make some of your very own oyster ketchup or ketchup or catchup in the 18th century style, get some fine fresh oysters and pound them in a mortar with salt, pounded mace, and cayenne pepper in the proportions of 1 ounce salt, 2 drachms mace, and 1 of cayenne to each pint of oysters. Pound them together and add a pint of white wine to each pint of oysters. Boil it some minutes and rub it through a sieve. Boil it again, skim it, and when cold, bottle, cork, and seal it. If a glass of brandy be added, it will keep good for a considerable time. And as 18th century recipes go, this one, in hand with sterilization of the storage container, is actually going to be okay. You just need to make sure of your boiling times. And unsolicited mention, if you want to see a real mushroom ketchup recipe in action, go check out the Townsend's YouTube channel. So along with being used as a condiment on disappointing foods at sea, the oyster ketchup was frequently added to other sauces and preparations to give more flavor, just as we use Worcestershire sauce and fish sauce today. Now, I did mention that there were other shellfish on the colonial table other than oysters. Crabs, lobsters, cockles, occasionally clams and mussels. The British were never particularly keen on whelks and other snails. First, the crabs. They were eaten a bit, but compared to the more plentiful lobster and then just fish, they were a lot of work for the amount of meat that they provided. So crabs were stewed a bit and were used as dressings for other seafood in houses where there was plenty of kitchen help, but crabs were low on the list. Lobsters, with their big tails, were easier for claiming meat and were eaten quite often, if occasionally as a disappointment. But based on the long cooking methods popular then, the rubbery meat was not particularly loved and lacked the deeper flavor of the oyster that was preferred. Oh, and that thing about people hating lobster, seeing it as a trash food, it was a bit true. The earliest colonists, as well with all people at the time, tend to see something that is plentiful and available for no work as something of low value, especially if they have not built up any affection for it. And these strange giant water beetles crawling upon the beach, for at that point lobsters were so plentiful they did just that, were fine and all, but they lacked the savor of beef or pork or other good respectable farm-raised or hunted meats, or the seasonally tasty salmon. So lobsters were in fact fed to the pigs on occasion. Now, as for the story about the prisoners protesting too much lobster, versions of this did happen. But to better understand why, let's do a little examination into why that became such a thing. First of all, we have to remember that lobsters crawl along the bottom of the sea. The humorism from last century that rated the goodness of foods by its closeness to heaven was still most certainly a thing. If carrots and scarrots were lowly for growing in the earth, think of the lowliness of the lobster and crab that crawled along a realm of the earth even below that. But even more than the ranking on the holiness scale, there was the preparation method problem. These days, our fine and fancy and fresh lobsters are cooked alive or immediately after a quick death. The colonial lobster cooking method, on the other hand, was to kill the lobster at the shore, then transport it for hours or even a day or two to its final destination before cooking it. This means that the digestive enzymes within the lobster or crab often had time to go to work on the meat and make it weird and spongy. And then, unlike our preferred method of boiling or steaming until just done, it was not uncommon to boil a lobster for half an hour. Or in a potting recipe I have, once the potted meat mixture is made from a previously boiled lobster, that is boiled for an hour again. Under these circumstances, I have a feeling this possibly spoiled, badly overcooked lobster would have me protesting. And since these were prisoners, you can believe there was no butter in sight. Mussels show up as an afterthought in English cookery, but were much enjoyed by both Dutch and French cooks. And at this point, all clams are called cockles, after the English versions. Keeping them alive until cooking was understood, hence the street call, cockles and mussels alive, alive-o. So clams were consumed and cooked not terribly, but not yet in chowder. Instead, they were usually eaten with strong sauces alongside other fish or pounded into sauces of their own. And like the fussy crabs, compared to the ubiquitous and already adored oyster, clams seemed like so much fuss for less good food anyway. So there are recipes for cockles in 18th century cookbooks, but usually kind of the one or two. They, like so much else, were an afterthought to the infinitely more preferred oyster. As with fish in the 17th century, where it was cod and some other things, when it comes to shellfish in the 18th century, it's oysters and some other stuff as well. And that will pretty much be the way it goes on into the next few seasons, and then becoming even more so as mechanization enters the arena. Next week is an idea week. Mercantilism. If you thought there were pirates before, well, buckle up because now there are more ports, more customers, and more products to trade. Oh, and wars. The 18th century is a big-time war afloat period as well. for the frenemies and their colonies and the navigation acts of 1696 have had time to kick in. I'll try to explain all these things next week and possibly bring up lemons as well. Thanks for listening. Information for the Intelligent Speech Conference 2022 are in the show description. Show notes for this episode will eventually be at thehistoryofamericanfood.blogspot.com. Any email questions or quibbles will reach me at thehistoryofamericanfood@gmail.com. Many thanks to all of you that have subscribed to and reviewed the show. It does make me more visible and more people can join in on the fun. Along with promised pictures and links, I'll also include any interesting media I consumed for the episode. And I will include the Townsend's YouTube channel link in the episode description as a great source for period cooking videos on several things I talked about in this episode and will be talking about in the future. Music for this podcast is Fingerlympics by Dr. Turtle. The link to the show notes is also in the show's Twitter bio @THOA Food and in the show description.